First of all, let me talk about the area that I'm going to provide the example for, and that will be in teaching web design. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down the grid that I provided for you that you're going to fill out for how you might apply CASA in your own particular example, and I'll explain both the columns, the idea from the standpoint of the learner, the designer, the instructor, and research and standards. And then also I'll explain a little bit about how each of those are operationalized in terms of the content, assessment, synchronous, and asynchronous, synchronous, and assessment categories. So let me go ahead and do that with the teaching web design example. And as you can see, I will address the particular questions that I ask in the grid and explain how I operationalize those within the grid to help you figure out how you can do your own application of using the CASA model for your own particular content areas that you're interested in. So first of all, from this particular example of teaching web design, I'm going to define the learners as high schoolers. So this particular series of educational experiences that I'm interested in designing are going to be targeted towards high schoolers learning how to do web design. In this particular example, since we deal with reality, and the reality is that most institutions, organizations, and educational um, schools can't actually have separate designers. Sometimes we do, most of the time we don't. So the teacher will also be the designer. So we call that teacher as designer. So the designer column will be the teacher as designer, and the instructor will be, of course, the teacher who's also designing it, and then the last column will be the research and standards. And then I'm going to break this down into the 4 different categories that I defined in the model. So let's take the idea of the content area first. So in the CASA model, if we're talking about teaching web design, if our learner target is high schoolers, if we look at that first column, first row, what do the high schoolers need to know in order to learn web design? So that's going to be our first understanding. In this particular area, we're going to be teaching them the more technical approach to web design. So we're going to be teaching them HTML and CSS. The objectives are that that they understand and can perform HTML and CSS coding to create web design. And additionally, we're going to define our environment as a blended environment, which means we have both face-to-face and online components that we can use in our model, in our application of our model. So from the teacher as designer standpoint, in the designer column, what does the designer need to consider about the content? Well, the designer needs to consider that students have to have access to understanding the content, so the designer needs to find or design tutorials about HTML and CSS, and then design lessons around those tutorials. So that will be the designer's job, and in this case also the teacher. So what will be the teacher's concern about the content? Well, the teacher will need to be able to be available for question and answer about the content to provide that additional layer of support structure beyond just the consuming of the information, so that they can make sure that the students are getting an understanding of the content, and also the teacher will need to be able to support their completion of projects. As we get to the other section, we'll see how we're bringing in projects in this particular example. Finally, what research and/or standards support this particular idea of using tutorials on HTML and CSS and being available for Q&A and support? Well, if we go back to our understanding of the multimodal learning, we can see that that definitely supports our idea from a research standpoint of using visual communications, of using video. And then if we go to the content area, if we're talking about high school, the International Society for Teacher Education, ISTE, is an entity that sets standards for a lot of different content areas in K to 12. They have technology standards, so we might actually see whether there's actually any particular standards that we might want to address as we create and design our teaching web design experience. So there might be particular recommendations that ISTE provides that we should consider in our design of the content. So that takes us to the next category of, okay, we know what the content is, HTML and CSS, learning web design. What kind of asynchronous experiences might we use in a blended environment to support the delivery of our content and to allow the learners to be successful? In this particular case, we might say, well, those tutorials that are designed by the designer, high schoolers definitely have to have access to them in both text and video format. But they need to have access to those in an asynchronous format, meaning they should be able to access them outside of the confines of their regular classroom. So as a designer, what is my consideration for making sure that they have a quality asynchronous experience? That would be to choose only the most appropriate options for this particular audience, so that when the designer reviews the tutorials, reviews the information that exists on HTML and CSS and designs lessons around them, that the designer takes into consideration the audience of high school students. And that's an important consideration in our teacher as designer must consider. And then from the instructor standpoint, how will they need to support the asynchronous environment? Well, with the flipped approach, they'll need to be able to be available as needed to support the students' understanding as they consume that particular content. So that might be in-class support, as we'll get to in the synchronous sessions category next, or it might be the availability of them via email or some other format to make sure that the students are getting that appropriate support from the instructor standpoint of that asynchronous material, that material is quality. And since the teacher and the teacher as designer is the same person, not necessarily a need to check the quality of the information and the appropriateness of the information that's being created for the asynchronous delivery. But if the designer and teacher were removed, if they were two different people, I would also add that to this category, that the instructor would definitely have to review the materials to make sure that they're appropriate for asynchronous delivery and that they meet the requirements that are needed. So what research and standards support our use of asynchronous communication in this delivery model in our blended environment? Well, we might look to flipped classroom research that shows that one approach to providing an educational blended experience might be to flip things around and to allow students to look at the content on their own time and to use the synchronous or the face-to-face time for other purposes, which takes us to the other purposes. So what should our synchronous considerations be? Well, from the learner's standpoint, it might be that they are actually able to assemble their projects in a face-to-face environment. So in this blended flipped approach, they're learning the materials on their own time, but they're actually considering, or they're actually completing the assignments in the face-to-face time. And so in order to do that, the designer must consider a premium use of face-to-face time. So as you're designing the materials, teacher as designer, how do I put this lesson plan, these experiences together to make sure that there's premium time both for their asynchronous consumption, so to speak, of the materials that are picked for them, and how do we maximize the use of their face-to-face time as they complete their projects? And that might be to ensure that there's plenty of instructor interaction. And so in this case, the instructor is going to support the project building by being at the location, face to face. We flip things around. The teacher becomes more of the guide on the side that will help the students as they actually start to put together their web designs using an HTML and CSS approach. And if we look at what research and standards support this, then we would say that problem and project-based learning research that shows in a flipped classroom approach, it can be very successful to have students learn the information outside of the classroom and actually start to create, put those materials together in the face-to-face time in our blended environment, which takes us to the most important part of our category. How do we assess this all and make sure that the students are successful? So from the student standpoint, there really needs to be multiple layers of evaluation to ensure that the information is being delivered appropriately and that the students are receiving and understanding the information as needed. And so we need to have a formative method for checking in that they're actually understanding those tutorials and or any other asynchronous material that they're getting on their own time, and then also a summative evaluation of their overall projects. So from a designer standpoint, well, okay, how do we think about how we're going to do formative evaluation? We need to consider how to measure both types of the both formative and summative evaluation. So we might say that from an assessment standpoint, if we're looking first at formative evaluation of the tutorials, maybe at the end of each week there has to be some way for students to check in their understanding. That could be the design of quizzes. That could be some type of journaling. That could be some type of discussion that you might want them to do to ensure that they're understanding the materials. But we need to make sure in a step-by-step process that we don't wait to that moment when they're face-to-face to find out that they didn't get the material yet, because then that defeats the purpose of having them actually do the project in the face-to-face if they don't understand the material yet. So as a designer, that's an important consideration. And from the summative standpoint, it's how do I measure whether that final project actually allows them to meet the objectives of the learning that I wanted them to. And so how do we put either a rubric together or some other uh, um, way, portfolio, project display, both instructor and peer evaluation to ensure that those objectives were met. And as a teacher, it is important from the assessment standpoint to know that to support the comprehension of those tutorials and to review the projects. So the teacher is going to be grading the quizzes or looking at discussions or reading reflective journals to make sure that the students are being supported, that they're learning the materials as they go along, and then obviously to review those final projects to make sure that the objectives are met. And what type of assessment research might support this particular approach? We might look at areas of authentic assessment. So very common and popular in a flipped classroom approach is this idea of allowing students to learn the information outside of the classroom in some context, guiding the students to the creation of those of some project based on that content, and allowing them to be creative in their creation of projects, and then providing some format of authentic assessment, either by the creation of a web page and perhaps peer review as part of that. That there are other approaches to assessment, portfolio review that one might consider for assessment in this particular area. So that's a very simple yet detailed example of how we might operationalize the CASA approach in a specific instance. In this case, teaching web design to high schoolers. And so I hope that fleshes out the idea a little bit more as you move to considering your own content areas, your own examples, and the confines of the experience that you'll have to deal with, whether it's online only, whether it's a blended experience, whether you're putting together a set of resources, whatever that happens to be. So thank you very much for your attention to my short presentation, and thank you for joining us in our class. Aloha, everyone.